And happy Tuesday, September 12th, 2023, and welcome to a brand new edition of what I like to call For the Birds. I am your host, the vegan you believe in, Kurt Cadet, aka Conscious Kurt, in the flesh as always. And here on For the Birds, I like to talk about different forms of toxic and negative behavior, the effects partaking that behavior has on people and their mental health, and what people can do to have a better handle on it, better understanding of it, in order to have a better quality of their lives going forward. I want to talk to you guys today about an issue that many people have a hard time with. For whatever reason, no matter how strong and how powerful some people are, they have a really hard time doing this that I'm going to talk about today. And that issue I'm here to talk about today is not being able to apologize. This issue has become a real pet peeve for me as I've gotten older, especially when it comes to dating. There's probably nothing that turns me off more than somebody who sucks at apologizing. And who not only sucks at it, who can never ever bring themselves to do it. Dealing with people like this is very frustrating, it's very aggravating, and more than anything else, it is disappointing. I do my best not to judge people when it comes to certain things, but when it comes to that, when it comes to the point where somebody cannot bring themselves to apologize when they mess up, then it's hard for me not to judge them. It's really hard for me not to. Because as I've said on this podcast before, and I'll say again, all of us, we make mistakes. We all mess up from time to time. And that's okay. But the thing you need to do when you make those mistakes is own up to them, admit them, and say my bad for it. It's not that hard. It's really not that hard. But unfortunately, for some people, it is that hard. It is that challenging. And they have such an inflated ego and such a self absorbed mentality that they just cannot bring themselves to do it. And in many cases, they think they are too good to do it. Well, I have news for you today. You're not too good to do it. You're not better than everybody else. And you need to check that motherfucking ego at the door. Because if you keep going down this path of not being able to own up to your mistakes and never being able to apologize when you know you messed up, then chances are you're going to have a lot of relationships that are going to be ruined and crumble to pieces because of that attitude. Yeah, the more you can apologize and the more you kind of have that self absorbed personality, the more people you're going to push and chase away. And then once it gets to that point, instead of looking to yourself and looking to what maybe you did wrong, you know what you're probably going to do? You're probably going to say that it wasn't your fault and that it was all everybody else's fault. And while maybe not every last one of those situations may have been your fault, at the end of the day, the common denominator in all these scenarios is you. And when you're the common denominator in all those different kind of scenarios and that many falling outs, you definitely bear some responsibility in it. And when you refuse to accept that responsibility and act like it's everybody else's fault, and you're too big of a person to ever own up to what you did wrong, then as I've said on many other issues on this podcast, that is some whack ass shit. And I don't respect it. So, what is it that brings people to the point where they're unable to ever admit when they're wrong and unable to ever apologize when they're wrong? What are the different things that cause people to have this kind of problem? Well, one big one, as I've talked about many a times, and I'll talk about again, is arrogance and ego. It's okay to have a high opinion of yourself and think highly of yourself, but there's a fine line between confidence and straight up arrogance. But the thing with people who are super arrogant and having a super inflated ego is that they think that they can do no wrong. Even if they do wrong, even if they do mess up, it's somehow never ever their fault. Yeah, these people will point the finger at everyone else and everything else but one place. And that one place and one person they'll never point the finger at is the person they see in the mirror. And when you're that much of an egomaniac and that much of a narcissist, the thought of ever apologizing or owning up to something you do wrong is just something too much for you to bear. It's something you can't be bothered with. And in some extreme cases, it's a fate for you that is worse than death. And it's just so sad. You could avoid so many issues and so many problems by just owning up to when you mess up and apologizing to people you do wrong. But instead, you choose to follow your ego. You choose to act like you're better than everyone. And no matter how much the evidence says otherwise, you can never, ever be wrong. I hate being around people with inflated egos for a lot of reasons, but if I had to pick maybe one that stands out most, I would say it's probably this. And this reason, probably more than any other, is the reason why people with inflated egos and who go on an ego trip usually end up traveling alone. The more you act like that, the more you behave that way, as I said in the beginning of this episode, the more people you are going to end up pushing away. And most of the people you will end up pushing away in the process are people you really do not want to lose. But you're too much of an egomaniac and you can't bring yourself to ever admit fault that you're willing to give those people up. And the older you get, the more you are this kind of person who can never apologize, the lonelier and miserable you're going to be in the long run. Another reason why people have a hard time apologizing and they suck at it so badly is because they're too obsessed with being right all the time. I did an episode on this podcast about this several weeks ago about people's obsession with being right. And that obsession with being right is so strong for many people that they can never apologize when they mess up. And hey, I know people that are right more than they're wrong and who are very smart. But no matter how smart anybody is, and no matter how much they may know, sometimes they're going to get it wrong. But there comes a point where people will be so obsessed and so consumed with getting the right answer all the time and getting things right all the time that when they get it wrong on a rare occasion, it's too tough of a pill to swallow. And it's a tough enough pill to swallow where they can't ever own up to it. Even if they are wrong, even if they are the one at fault, they just can never accept it because they always have to be right. They always have to get the last word. They always have to be the one who's the smartest person in the room. And it's a big problem when somebody actually believes 100% to the core that they are always right and they never get it wrong ever. And they say that they never ever make mistakes. That attitude is super arrogant, super ignorant, and it just makes them look like even more of a fool when they get it wrong and can't own up to it. For them, it's just such a shame and such an embarrassment that comes with getting things wrong and being wrong that they avoid it at all costs. And even if they look like the asshole in the process and look like the ignorant one in the process, they don't care. As long as they're right, as long as they get the last word, as long as everybody bows down to them. Yeah, and when you're somebody who's that obsessed and consumed with being right all the time, then doing something as simple as apologizing is like a way of admitting defeat. And that's the sad part about it when you want to be right all the time so badly that you think being wrong every once in a while is like a form of weakness and that it makes you look like less of a person, then you really have a problem. And hey, it's okay to fight for your cause when you know you're right and stand by it and not back down from it. But when you need to be right so badly that you can never ever admit when you're wrong, even when you really are wrong, then you're a soft ass. I'm sorry to say, that's some soft ass shit. Never being able to admit when you're wrong is some real soft ass shit. No matter how many times you may be right. And another reason why some people suck at apologizing and can never ever admit when they're wrong is because they were never taught to. Many of our issues, many of our problems can be traced back to the way we were raised and the way we grew up. And when somebody grows up with parents who let them get away with everything and never discipline them and never call them out when they mess up, then chances are that person is going to grow up to be somebody who thinks they could just act any way they please, behave any way they please, and never admit to when they mess up. When you grow up to be somebody who's never taught right from wrong and never held accountable when they misbehave or they mess up, then chances are you're going to grow up to be that kind of person who always misbehaves, always acts out, and whenever you're called out for it, put on blast for it, you can't handle it. You can't own up to it. You can't admit that you messed up. You know why? Because no one ever sat down and taught you that that's what an adult does. An adult admits when they make a mistake, owns up to it, and apologizes to those they did wrong in the process. And sadly, unfortunately, many people were never taught to be this way growing up. They were never taught to admit when they're wrong. They were never taught to apologize to those they did wrong because they grew up around people who did not do any of that shit either. And they picked up on that behavior and took that behavior into their own adulthood. And as a result, they turned out to be the asshole that they turned out to be. Yeah, when you don't have that proper guidance, when you don't have the right people teaching you right from wrong, it is bound to have an effect on your adult life. And when you're unable to recognize those faults and recognize those mistakes, then other people aren't going to like the way you turn out. And probably most of all, you're not going to like the way you turn out either. It's something I've seen all too often where people who grew up with parents who like never disciplined them, never called them out when they messed up, and never really parented them the way they should have been parented, they grew up to be a bunch of obnoxious, annoying screw ups. They never grew up, they never matured, and they never learned to take any accountability for their actions. Yeah, if you don't grow up in a home where you're taught about accountability and taught about admitting when you make mistakes, then the chances of you growing up to be somebody who never takes accountability and never admits when they're wrong is very, very high. And unless you recognize how toxic that behavior is on your own and are able to eventually learn that on your own, then I feel bad for anybody who has to be around you. And lastly, a big reason why people can't ever apologize or ever admit when they're wrong is because they're in a position of authority. Whether you're a parent or whether you're the boss of a company or the manager, whatever it is, sometimes people who are in high positions of authority have a hard time admitting when they mess up and a hard time admitting when they're at fault. Reason being is because since they're in a position of power and a position of authority, then they feel like they don't have to ever apologize or ever have to admit when they're wrong because they're the one in charge, they're the boss, so anything they say goes. And sadly, I've come across many of a person like this throughout my life who are authority figures who thought they could throw their weight around, who could mess with you any way they saw fit. And anytime they made a mistake and anytime they were in the wrong, they could never admit it. They'll come up with any excuse they can think of to justify their actions. They'll sugarcoat it like a motherfucking donut or waffles at a fucking diner. And they'll do anything except admit fault. And I've been seeing a lot of memes over the last few years about the difference between a boss and a leader. And I'll come to this conclusion. A boss is someone who can never admit that they're wrong and they always have to be right. But a leader is someone who can admit that they're wrong and own up to it and actually try to do better from it. That's real leadership, is when you own up to your mistakes, show other people that it's okay to own up to their mistakes as well, and you do better. Yeah, I don't like this quality in family members that are older than me, and I also especially don't like those qualities in anybody I've worked for throughout my life. It's very immature, it lacks leadership, and overall it's just a huge, huge character flaw. And honestly, I'll say it, if you can't apologize, if you can never admit when you're wrong, you're a little bitch. You really are. You are a little bitch. Whether you're a parent who can't do it, an authority figure at work who can't do it, whatever it is, if you can never apologize, you can never admit to your mistakes, you are a bitch. And being somebody like this, being somebody who can never admit fault and never own up to when they mess up, that shit is for the birds. And now that I've gotten older and learned more about this, now I can understand the reason why two of my best friends in high school always had a problem with the authority figures. I used to be unable to understand it back then, but now that I've gotten older and learned more about this, sometimes people in authority go on a power trip and have a way of throwing their weight around and acting like just because they're the ones in charge or they're the ones who are older, that they don't ever have to admit to those that they're in charge of that they messed up, that they did something wrong, and actually say that they're sorry for it. Because they're the authority figure. They're better than us. They're older than us. Why should they ever have to admit they're wrong? They're never wrong. They're always right because they're in authority, because they're older. Bullshit. Major league bullshit. Even if you are older, even if you have power, that does not mean that you are incapable of messing up. And when you mess up and you do wrong by those you are in charge of, you owe it to them to own up to being wrong. Not sugarcoating it, not acting like you were justified in your actions, or even worse, trying to pin it on them and trying to blame them for it. Nah, if you're an authority figure, especially somebody in charge of other people, you more than anyone else should admit when you are wrong and say my bad when you are wrong. Yeah, being an authority figure and being somebody in charge does not give you a pass to do that kind of bullshit. So now that I've broken down the different reasons people may suck at apologizing and suck at admitting when they're wrong, let's break down the different ways they can be better at this and actually build up the courage and build up the strength to admit when they're wrong, at least every once in a while. But one of the first things they can do is lose the freaking ego. Like I said before, when you're on an ego trip, an inflated ego trip, usually you end up traveling alone. But eventually there has to come a point where you come off that ego trip and realize that not everything centers around you. And no matter how great you think you are, and no matter how amazing you think you are, it is okay to admit when you mess up. It doesn't make you any less great. It doesn't make you any less amazing. Hell, by being able to do that, it adds even more to those qualities. So if it'll add more to those qualities, why the fuck won't you do it? Yeah, eventually you have to drop that ego shit and understand that apologizing is not beneath you. It's not beneath anybody. And when you get off your ego trip and understand that sometimes you make mistakes, then it won't be so hard for you to say the words, my bad, I'm sorry, I made a mistake, I messed up. Because when you can admit those things, you're not letting your ego take over, you're letting yourself take over. Yeah, when you don't have that much of an inflated ego and understand that the whole world does not revolve around you, then you'll have more peace in your life. And one of those things in life that brings you peace is owning up to your mistakes and apologizing for those mistakes when those mistakes affect other people. The more you can do this and the more you can hold yourself accountable, the more mature you're going to become in the process. And more than anything, the better person you'll be in the process at that too. Another way people can be better at apologizing and owning up to their mistakes is getting out of their own way. Being somebody who could never admit any fault and never hold themselves accountable at all when they mess up is a clear indication that somebody is just stuck and set in their ways. They can never compromise. They can never listen to another person's point of view. It has to be 100% their way or the highway. And even when they have their way and they get their way all the time and it still doesn't go right, they can never admit that they played some kind of part in it. And that's what I mean when I say, and that's why I say getting out of your own way and taking accountability for some of the things in your life that didn't go right, and maybe for some of the things you did wrong to other people, will move your life forward instead of backwards. Yeah, because no matter how smart you think you are, no matter how many times you are right, your way is not the only way. And sometimes your way isn't the right way. And when you can own up to that and say, hey, I screwed up in this area. Hey, I screwed up in that area. Hey, I shouldn't have treated this person that way or that person that way. Then you're doing grown adult shit. Because apologizing and holding yourself accountable is grown adult shit. Because there is such a thing as self-sabotage. And a big part of self-sabotage is when you get stuck in your ways and set in your ways to the point where you can never be wrong. And you being wrong is something that's impossible. Well, guess what? It's very possible. Hell, it's inevitable. But when that time comes when you are wrong, don't be so set in your ways that you can't admit it. Just say, hey, my bad. I got it wrong. I thought one way about it before, but it turned out to not work out. And hey, that's on me. And there just comes to a point where you have to humble yourself and understand that your way is not the only way. And when you can do that and be open minded, chances are things will work out a lot better for you. And chances are you'll be able to maintain and keep a lot more relationships as time goes on. And another way people can be better at apologizing and better at admitting when they're wrong is understanding that there is no shame in admitting those things. As I talked about earlier on this episode, a big reason why a lot of people have a hard time admitting when they're wrong or admitting when they make a mistake is because they feel shame when it comes to those things. Shame, embarrassment, and a way they feel like they're less of a person because of that. And I'm here to tell anybody who thinks that way today, you are wrong. There is 100% no shame. There is 100% nothing to feel embarrassed about when you admit when you're wrong. You could be a little embarrassed about the mistake you made, but you don't have to be embarrassed about owning up to it and apologizing for it. You're not any less of a man or less of a woman if you could admit when you mess up. I know there's a lot of pressure for people to prove how smart they are and how tough they are and how strong they are. But just understand, admitting fault, admitting to a mistake does not take away from any of that. You can still be strong, you can still be smart, you can still be tough, and still admit when you screw up at the times you do screw up. And wherever you learn that you should be ashamed of apologizing, ashamed of messing up, and that you're weak if you do those things, the person who taught you that owes you a big apology. Because that shit is dead wrong, that shit is toxic, that shit is garbage, and the person who taught you that, chances are, probably taught you a bunch of other toxic things you probably should have never learned in the first place. Yeah, because people will act like apologizing and holding themselves accountable is so hard and so challenging. But in reality, it's not. It's not that hard at all. The only reason why it seems hard is because your attitude and your ego makes it hard. But if you can check that shit at the door and realize that you're no less strong and no less smart because you admit when you're wrong, then doing it for you will eventually just become second nature. Yeah, I'm telling you, I know it sucks to be wrong. I know it sucks to mess up and make mistakes. I get it, but never being able to own up to it and never Apologizing for it only makes it harder. So I'm telling you, holding yourself accountable, admitting when you're wrong and when you make mistakes will make things just so much easier for you. It'll be so much easier, so much less stressful, and you're not going to screw up any relationships along the way by doing that. If you are legit wrong and you are legit the person who's at fault, just say, my bad, I messed up, I'll do better next time, and then move on. That simple, that easy. You don't have to feel embarrassed about it. You don't have to feel like less of a person about it. If you can just say those simple words, then you're good. But just don't make it any harder than it has to be. And lastly, a way people can be better at apologizing and admitting when they're wrong is by putting themselves in the position of the ones they did wrong. That's the thing. A lot of people have a hard time with empathy, and also in this case, a hard time with apologizing to someone they did wrong because they can't put themselves in that person's position. They can't put themselves in that person's shoes and maybe understand the way that they felt by their actions or the way that their actions affected that said person. For whatever reason, they just have a hard time doing that. But I'm here to tell you, if you are someone that way, then I plead with you to practice doing this more often until you get better at it. Because another thing, I really feel like a lot of us are divided in the world today, and there's a lot of division in the world today because we have a hard time putting ourselves in the positions of other people. And if you can get out of your own head and your own way and put yourself in another person's position and see maybe why they felt the way they did, then things will probably make more sense to you. And maybe you'll start to see why what you did to them was wrong and why they felt so bad about it. And it'll be a lot easier for you to own up to being wrong. Whether it's a spouse, whether it's a friend, whether it's a family member, sometimes you're going to hurt the people you love. Whether you meant to do it or didn't mean to do it, sometimes it's just going to happen. But when that does happen, you really need to put yourself in their position and really dig deep and understand why they felt so hurt by your actions and why they're so upset at you for your actions. And then when you can see things from their perspective and you can see why they felt the way they felt, it won't be so hard for you to apologize to them and say, hey, I'm sorry that I hurt you the way I hurt you. I'm sorry that what I did caused you to feel the way that you felt. And I promise to do better. Please forgive me. So many relationships can be saved and so many relationships can progress even further if people would just be willing to do this. But just a lot of people think it's so hard and that they lose ground and they lose power by doing this that they'll refuse to do it. Even if it costs them the relationship in the process, they still, for whatever reason, just can't bring themselves to do that. And if you can't do this, if you're somebody who can't put yourself in another person's shoes and see why your actions hurt them the way they did, then you probably don't deserve that person. And that person you hurt has every right to not want to be a part of your life anymore and get as far away from you as possible. But if you can swallow your pride and realize the world doesn't revolve around you and how sometimes maybe your actions hurt others and take some accountability for that, then you're somebody who is worthy of those relationships. And that's what really apologizing at the end of the day comes down to. Understanding how your actions and what you do affects others. And when you know you did wrong by somebody, especially somebody that you love and care about, that admitting to that is a non-negotiable. For any relationship to survive or even thrive, accountability and always apologizing when one or the other messes up is something that needs to happen regularly. That pride bullshit, that ego bullshit, that shit has to go. If you want to maintain relationships, if you want to save relationships and have them be as strong as possible, then that accountability shit needs to be present at all times. So that's why I say if you could put yourself in someone else's shoes and see why they feel the way they do, then apologizing to them will be so much easier. It's already not that hard to begin with, and it shouldn't be, but just being able to do that and have some kind of empathy for somebody else makes it all the more simple to do. So, my final thoughts on this whole thing is this: it's okay to be right, and it's okay to brag about it when you are right, and even admit that you are right more than you're wrong. But when you always have to be right, whether you're an authority figure, whether you're a parent, whether you're a friend, whether you're a spouse, and you have the attitude that admitting fault and admitting when you're wrong is something that's beneath you, then it's clear that it's not you taking over, it's your ego and your arrogance taking over. The reason why a lot of people grow up to be assholes and the reason why a lot of relationships are ruined and don't last is because of many people's lack of accountability. No matter how wrong they are, no matter how badly they mess up, some people just can't bring themselves to admit that. And while they may think that admitting fault and admitting that they're wrong is weak, but the reality is not being able to admit those things is weak, soft, and pathetic. When you can't ever take accountability for your actions and ever apologize to people you did wrong, then you're a child. You're not doing grown adult shit. You're not doing grown people shit. You're doing little kid shit. But on the flip side, if you're somebody who can own up to their mistakes and can admit when they're wrong and can apologize to those they did wrong, even if they didn't mean to, then you are a grown up. You are an adult. You are somebody who's making progress in life. And you are someone who cares about maintaining the relationships they have, and also you're someone who clearly wants to have other healthy relationships in the future. Yeah, because like I said earlier, admitting fault and admitting when you're wrong is so hard for so many people, but the reason why is because they make it hard. They make it complicated. They make it challenging. But they would just be doing themselves so much good if they got out of their own way and understood the fact that it's not that hard to apologize. It's not that challenging to apologize. Hell, in all honesty, it's actually pretty easy. And if they could just come to that realization and come to that understanding, then they'll have a huge breakthrough in their life. Other people will like them more and like being around them more. And most importantly of all, they'll like themselves a lot more too. Because I'll even say myself, whenever I admit I'm at fault and whenever I apologize when I mess up or do somebody wrong, it's also the right thing to do. But also, I feel good about myself afterwards. Because I'm being an adult, I'm being a grown up. And when you can do that, check your ego at the door and be somebody that you yourself can look up to, then you'll be a far better person for it. So whenever you find yourself in a place where you make a mistake, you screw up, or you do wrong by someone, man up or woman up and own up to it. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Don't make it more complicated and challenging than it has to be. Just own it, fix it, apologize to who you need to apologize to, and move on with your life. It's that simple, it's that easy, and you'll save yourself a lot of trouble and a lot of bullshit in the process. Well, that's all the time I have for you guys today here on For the Birds. And like I've said before, I'm not a licensed doctor or therapist, but I do have a lot of personal experience in my life dealing with a lot of these issues. So I like to use this podcast as a platform to help others get through these issues in a much easier way than I did. And if you ever want to contact me or talk to me, you can follow me on my various social media sites, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. look up my first and last name, Kirk Cadet. Send me a friend request, send me a message. I'd be more than happy to connect with you, talk to you about any of these issues. And also, if you want to listen to any other episodes of this podcast in the archives, you can find it on Spotify, Spreaker, or YouTube. Leave a comment on any of the episodes and let me know what you like about them, what you don't like about them. And for a long time to come, I will be here on For the Birds, exposing and calling out many forms of toxic and negative behavior, the effects participating in that behavior has on us and our mental health, and what we can do to have a better handle and understanding of it in order to have a better quality of our lives in the future. So until next time, this is Kirk Cadet for another edition of For the Birds. Take care, God bless, and remember, do not be an asshole in real life or on social media. Have a good one, guys.